Only on KHOU 11, a Missouri City family claims Fort Bend ISD is denying special education services to their child. And next week, they'll take their concerns to the state. The family speaking only with KHOU 11's Jalissa Garza, who joins us now with a look at how things got to this point. Jalissa?
Well, Len, the hearing will be on the denial of special education services and district intimidation. The family has been part of the district for about 7 years now and tells me that denial of services has been an ongoing issue. All they've been asking for is that their child's IEP or individualized education program be followed, but they say it's not being done.
Feeling good about it?
Larry George is the parent of a child who has a learning disability and requires some special education services.
He has a reading comprehension disability. He can be supported in a general ed setting.
George has done everything he can outside the classroom to make sure his child succeeds inside the classroom.
He's had a tutor that supports him since second grade, and now he's a freshman, same tutor.
But he says Fort Bend ISD isn't doing their part.
There's been numerous of times where the IEP was not implemented, the support was not provided by the district.
An IEP stands for Individualized Education Program. Education experts say it's the basis of special education. The Texas Education Agency says the services can range in a variety of ways.
Everything from modifications in the general education classroom to the far end of the spectrum where kids are in a self-contained classroom.
This specific program is agreed upon between the school and the parents of the student. But George says Fort Bend ISD hasn't been implementing the IEP they agreed upon.
I have worked tirelessly with the district and trying to get them to collaborate and fix this.
George says he's done all he can, even going to the TEA himself, who sided with him and put the district on a corrective action plan. But he says nothing changed. Eventually, George sought out help from special needs advocate Karen Mayer Cunningham.
Every complaint Mr. George has filed without me has been substantiated that his complaints were valid.
Cunningham is no stranger to working with school districts when it comes to special education services and says resolving this issue has been more difficult than it should be.
When we simply are asking for the IEP to be implemented in the conformity that we agreed upon in the meetings, and they just will not do it.
We reached out to Fort Bend ISD. The district tells us they can't comment publicly on the case in order to protect and respect the students' privacy. But we've learned that here in Texas, the George family isn't alone in dealing with a situation like this.
I interviewed about 25 parents of across the state who have children with disabilities just to learn about their experiences navigating the process.
Associate Professor of Education at UT Austin, David DeMatthews, says a lack of special education services has been a problem for years. In 2018, the Department of Education found the state was violating federal law.
The state was failing to fulfill its monitoring responsibilities and failing to ensure that every child in Texas is proactively identified if they have an eligible disability and then provided with what is called a free and appropriate public education.
As challenges in education persist, George is just hoping his families can be solved.
I'm just really exhausted. I'm looking for change within Fort Bend ISD.
In addition to that hearing, a federal investigation is open with the Office of Civil Rights on Disability, Retaliation, and Race.
Wow, quite a story, Jalissa. So where can families go for help?
So Len, we want to bridge that gap and help families. So what we're going to be doing tonight after the 6 o'clock newscast, we're going to be live on KHOU Plus answering questions with an education expert you heard from in tonight's story. You can text 713-526-1111 with your questions. And we also have links to services right now on KHOU.com. Good evening, Jalissa Garza here, reporter with KHOU. We brought you a story earlier today in the 6 o'clock newscast about special education services. A family from Missouri City coming to us and saying that there's a lack of those services for their child at their school district. Now, in the story, we heard from one expert, David DeMatthews, at UT Austin. We brought him back in this evening to answer parents' questions. David, I know you get a lot of questions. If you could just introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about those special education questions you get often.
Sure. So my name's Dave DeMatthews, and I'm a professor at UT Austin in the College of Education. I teach classes around leadership and policy and also in special education. And really, whenever there's a story about special education, I tend to get a lot of follow-ups from parents asking about how to navigate the process, how to work with schools and districts, what to do when there are challenges in terms of getting evaluations done on time, or when the family disagrees with what's happening, some of the decisions that are being made in the school or in the school district. So pretty regularly I hear from parents expressing concern, and also expressing concern that when they reach out to the Texas Education Agency or other resources, that they're just not getting the help that they need.
Now, something else, David, that you helped us spotlight in this story is that what the family is going through that we spoke with, they're not alone. Tell me a little bit. I know you interviewed about 25 families about the lack of special education services across districts, across the state. Tell me a little bit about your findings from talking to those 25 families as we wait for some questions from viewers.
Sure. So one of my former students and I, we interviewed about 25 parents from across Texas. And you consistently kind of hear that the challenges that families face, and they evolve. And so early on, a lot of parents, they're optimistic that their needs are going to be met and they're going to be supported, and that their input and their voice is going to matter. And pretty quickly, this honeymoon phase wears off for a lot of parents. And that's not to say some schools and school districts don't do a great job, but often early on, parents kind of hit the reality really quick that they don't know much about the laws and the regulations. There's a lot of jargon in meetings. And so whether it's IEP or FAPE or LRE, there's all these terms kind of being thrown at them. And it's really hard for them to give input in a meaningful way, especially if they're not that knowledgeable about the law and about their child's disability. And early on, they're not. So as they, year after year of kind of going through this, as their child is matriculating, they often learn that they're going to need to advocate for themselves. They're going to need to find a coalition of other parents so that they can learn more and share information. And a lot of times through the years, parents end up becoming advocates and helping usher other families who are newer to the process along. And so we've seen that across our interviews, and that's across disabilities and disability types, that it's a big issue. It's a big area of concern. And one of there's a few big reasons for why that is. First, historically, teachers and principals, they have not been well prepared in special education and knowing the federal special education laws. Secondly, though, Texas has really done a poor job as a state for many, many years now. They've been rated as needs improvement by the U.S. Department of Education for years and years now. They've had some policies that were deemed illegal. They've made some cuts to special education funding. And so there have been a lot of challenges that have made it really hard to serve students with disabilities in public schools. And so there's really a few different reasons why so many parents have these concerns and are fighting and advocating every day for their children and for other children with disabilities in Texas.
And we have a few questions already. We've got 3 from one viewer, so kind of want to go down this list with the first one. Is there a list of advocates that can help with IEP goals and implementation? I know you sent us a few links that we have posted on khou.com. Can you just walk through just a few of, a list of advocates or groups that you recommend for parents?
I think what's important is to find the local advocacy groups. And so looking in Houston, say, and looking along the same disability classification or identification of your child. And so there's different parent groups. So look for parent groups within your school district. Look for parent groups of children with, say, intellectual disabilities or emotional and behavioral disabilities. Facebook has been a big convening space now for parent groups, advocacy groups. And so every area, every region, and now even because of social media, there's a lot of groups that are kind of parent groups that are out there that you can connect with pretty easily. You can also search social media. So there's been a lot of downside to social media, but social media has been a great place for parents to connect with each other, to help navigate. And I would say that would be the first place to look. The TEA website actually has some good resources. The Houston area Education Service Center has good resources for parents. So I would recommend starting there, because parents in those groups tend to have experience and they know kind of which groups are the strongest, what potential advocates can provide support. And so I would definitely start there.
Right. Thank you so much. I know. And again, at khou.com, we've got a list that Mr. DeMatthews sent to us today. So you can find those as well after this or later on throughout the evening, throughout the night, throughout the weekend. Another question, and I know we've kind of talked about this, how can districts be held responsible for not implementing these goals? And I know we touched on that a little bit in the story, that there's kind of a process, right? And not every parent knows about that. So kind of walk them through what they should do if, the district is not implementing these goals.
So at an individual level, if you're a parent and you feel like you have an IEP that is well written, but that the district isn't following it, then it's important for you to first communicate that with the principal of the school and try as best as you can to resolve it there. So with the federal special education law, IDEA, it's really important. Congress's intent with that law is that families and schools would be partners. And so first, it's important to try to resolve that issue. And so talking to the principal, talking to the teachers is important. But if that doesn't remedy the situation, you still feel that that's not helping you, then you can reach out to your school district. Every school district has a special education director who is specifically responsible for special education in the district. And so that could be another place that you can reach out to. So the Office of Special Education or the Department of Special Education in your school district. You could also show up to a school board to a school board meeting and raise concerns. But there is also a set of rights that all parents of children with disabilities or children who are suspected of having disabilities, so a child might be in the identification process, so they have due process rights. And so anytime a parent disagrees with any decision that a school or district makes, even if that decision is they're not going to evaluate that child for special education eligibility, the parent has the right to file a complaint against the district, to have a resolution session or a mediation session with the district where somebody can help navigate that process. Sometimes parents in the school, principal, teachers, they don't see eye to eye, and having just an outsider help mediate helps. But the final step really for parents is filing a due process complaint, which goes to a due process hearing, and it kind of it mimics a kind of court system. And so both sides, the district and the parent, present evidence. They can bring in testimony and subpoena witnesses even, to describe and explain why they feel like they're correct and that the other side is not adhering to IDEA. And so that's another mechanism. Unfortunately, those things can take a little bit of time. They can be costly and difficult to navigate. And sometimes hearing officers kind of prompt parents and districts to go back to the table and work together, out of a belief that issues are always best resolved when teachers and families work together.
Right, and I know we talked about that before, so really just kind of want to summarize that for people. Go to the district, go to the special education director. From there, you can take other steps like going to the TEA and a state due hearing process, but really start at the district and try to resolve it there. But there are steps that you can go beyond that. So just kind of want to reiterate that, because I know we've talked about that a few times for myself to learn for the story, the entire process. On to the next question now, and this is something I know that you and I have also talked about. Do laws need to be changed in Texas? I know in my story tonight and in our interview in 2018, I mean, Texas was spotlighted for, breaking federal law when it came to special education services. So do laws need to be changed?
It's not that the laws need to be changed. TEA has to fulfill its duties under the law, and that just hasn't been the case. And what they created back in 2004, having a performance indicator where they evaluated districts based on an arbitrary number where 8.5% of students with disabilities or less, the school district would score a perfect score. That created significant problems. So school districts under that accountability pressure started to delay or even deny eligible students with disabilities access to special education. And so that went on for more than a decade in Texas. It wasn't until 2018 when the U.S. Department of Education, after investigating Texas, concluded that Texas was breaking the law. They were failing to identify students proactively, which is their responsibility. They were failing to monitor the implementation of the law, so they should have caught this, and they were failing to provide technical assistance. So making sure that school districts are knowledgeable and able to actually implement the law as written. And so it wasn't actually the fact that there was a problematic law. There was a problematic policy, and that policy has been removed. But really, it was the state not complying with the act. And so that has been one big problem. The other has just been funding. Funding has been a pretty significant problem in Texas. We have a pretty inequitable school finance system, and special education is costly. There has been some illegal cuts in the past that the state has actually had to remedy. And we just saw in this last legislative session a governor pursue vouchers, which didn't provide any protections for students with disabilities, actually, but no increase in funding for schools to serve students with disabilities. And so that's a big challenge. You know, school districts and schools need to do a better job supporting students with disabilities. That's true, but they need money, they need resources, they need training. And the state has failed to deliver for far too long. And that's a big problem. And I think that's why parents are experiencing a lot of these frustrations.
And thank you always for sharing that insight. I know, and so again, that question, you know, do laws need to be changed? But as you said, it really stems down to funding and resources for each school district. Now, that kind of gets us into our next question. A parent wants to know, how do you work around school administrations when the school is not implementing your child's IEP, which is something, you know, we kind of talked about in the story today. What do you advise for those parents? The school's not doing it. Should they just go to the TEA if it's not getting resolved there? Should they try a state due hearing process? What do you recommend?
That's a tough question. So again, first and foremost, try, if possible, to have a meeting with that principal, ask to observe the child in the classroom with the principal. What's written in the IEP should be observable in a classroom observation with the parent and the principal. And if that principal is not willing to do that, then the next step should be to go to the school district, take that to the special education director, take that to the superintendent, raise concern about the school district's lack of responsiveness. And then, you know, after that, if that still doesn't remedy it, I also think filing a complaint against the district. The district is obligated to implement that child's IEP as it's written. That's the plan that is there to ensure that that child receives the education that's required. So if they're not doing that, that's a big problem. Parents should also try as much as they can, if they're really concerned, to collect data. And so part of that IEP includes progress monitoring and progress reports. And so parents can ask for you know, those records to see how their child's progressing. If the school district can't provide, if the school can't provide those progress monitoring tools, that's another red flag and a concern. It's a piece of evidence that down the road can be used to reflect that the school district or the school is not providing those services, not following the IEP.
So really, it's important for these parents to know you have rights. You can go to the district and ask questions. You can go to the principal. You can reach out to who you need to get those answers. Now, another question from another parent, and again, thank you, Mr. DeMatthews, for doing this with us. This is really helpful for so many families. One person says that their child is in second grade on an IEP in a general education classroom with an AU diagnosis. The parent says they don't think that their student deserves to fail if they can't put their knowledge on paper, and no one is being held accountable. Now, I know that's tricky because you've told me sometimes kids can be in general ed with IEPs. What is your best advice for this parent?
It's kind of hard to give advice in that situation, just in general, because there's so many different moving parts here. You know, so I can't really kind of get into specifics without knowing more. But I would just say to the parent, understand your child's IEP, understand the procedural safeguards and the rights you have, and again, try to get into the classroom and observe what's happening in the classroom, talk to the teachers, look at if there's some discrepancies in terms of how the child's doing, look at the IEP, look at the assessments, see if they were given the appropriate accommodations. And I will say, on the other hand, sometimes parents get a little get overly concerned or a little overzealous, especially in the early grades. If a child doesn't do good on a test or a child doesn't do good on an assessment, one test or one assessment is not the end of the world. If that IEP is well written and it has goals and the school is helping that child meet those goals, it's a long-term plan. It's not just about whether a child passes or scores an 80 or a 90 on one test. And so it's a tough thing for parents. They want what's best, absolutely what's best for their child. But sometimes there is it takes a little bit of time for things to go according to plan.
Right, and something that you told me outside before we get into this next question, just to follow up on this parent's question, I remember you told me before that you can go back, right, if you want to meet again about this IEP. So if that parent does feel, hey, my kid is not doing good in general ed with this IEP, could they go back and say, hey, I'd like to get another one, or come back to the table and see what we can do?
So once a child's found eligible for special education, they get an IEP, and that IEP is developed with the school and with the parent and with the child. If at any point in time within that school year things aren't going right, the parent can request to have a meeting. They can talk about what's going on. They can kind of make sure that the IEP is being implemented. But if they think maybe the IEP, everybody came together, they thought that the IEP was going to help, but it turns out maybe there's some different supports or different services that are needed, the parent can certainly request that there's another IEP meeting and that IEP is revised. The school district doesn't have to agree with the parent. The school doesn't have to agree with the parent. But if they don't agree, if they think the IEP is appropriate and they're going to continue to follow it, they have to notify the parent in writing that they're not going to, have that meeting. And then again, the parent has these due process rights. They can then, follow those due process rights. And so parents always have the right to request that IEP be revised. They always have the right to request from teachers and principals to have meetings to discuss the progress of their kids or what more can be done to support them.
Right, and that's exactly why we're doing this. We want parents to know their rights and have these questions answered. Now, another question from a parent: if your child has an IEP, does the district have to support a doctor or therapist or anything like that?
There's for the most part with the nation's special education law, one single diagnosis or one single recommendation does not mean that the school or school district has to do it. So all the decisions around the types of services and supports and even eligibility, they're not made by a doctor, they're not made by a singular expert, they're made by that IEP team, they're made by a committee of people, and it's an inclusive, it should be an authentic dialogue. Parents should be meaningfully included. Ultimately, the school district has kind of the final say in what happens. But so any one doctor's point of view is not the only thing that is considered. That those meetings always have to include multiple forms of data, multiple voices.
Now, I know you mentioned earlier the lack of funding. That's something, we've talked about, not just in special education, but just education overall in the state of Texas. One parent's asking, are the schools using their funding appropriately in special education? Now, I know you can't speak specifics to that, but just as an expert who's been part of education, what are your thoughts on that?
The schools, there's a funding crisis when it comes to special education in Texas. There's been cuts. It's hard to hire special education teachers, school psychologists, people to provide related services. And as a result of not having that workforce available because of pay, for a variety of reasons, school districts are often now even having to contract with outside vendors, which costs them even more money to provide services. And so School districts are generally spend special education dollars and all their dollars on their workforce. The real challenge is just not having enough money to recruit and retain talented people. And that is kind of the real reason that we're seeing a lot of the problems that we're seeing, not because school districts are frivolous with a little bit of money that they have to spend.
And I think that tail end of your answer leads into another question we just got from a teacher with a SPED certification with both general education students, AU ADHD students as well. This teacher says they feel that it is a burden, especially when students are switching to another teacher who isn't or doesn't have SPED background. Is that acceptable?
It's all about what's in that child's IEP. Kind of where the child is going to be provided services, who's going to provide those services, how a special education teacher is going to support a general education teacher in a general education classroom setting. And so everything's individualized. And that's a challenge with kind of understanding individual cases for parents, is that each kid is different. An IEP is individualized, and so there's not a one size fits all. For special education teachers, though, I will say, they have one of the most challenging jobs in education. They're often covering multiple grades, working with multiple teachers, handling parent issues, developing, writing IEP goals, progress monitoring. And so they have a really, really challenging job. And so when there are changes during the school year, if students switch classes, that puts great demands and great burdens on special education teachers in particular. And again, there's a funding issue. So we need more special education teachers. We need special education teachers to stay in their schools. They're burning out at a fast rate. They're turning over at a fast rate. And so that churn also just has an impact on how well that school can coordinate services and work with teachers and build relationships with families. And that just makes special education teachers' jobs harder and harder.
Well, thank you so much for that insight. We do have another question. What do you do if the school is not providing data? Now, I know one of the things you recommended was get in the classroom, see what's going on. What if a parent is requesting, hey, I need some data, some things to prove, some proof to back these things up? What if the school's not doing that? What do you do then?
It's absolutely unacceptable that a school will not provide records to parents. And so, again, it's the same process. If things are not going well with you and your school, again, you should ask the teacher in writing, send it via email, request to meet that you want to see the students' records. If that doesn't work, follow up, put in writing to the school principal that you're requesting to see these records. You're requesting to have meetings and learn about how your child's progressing, especially on their IEP goals. If that's not working, do the same thing with the school district. Create an electronic paper trail documenting that behavior, because that behavior is very, very problematic. Parents have the right to know, to see their child's records and to have insight into what's happening in the classroom. And if it does have to go to a due process hearing, I can assure you that a hearing officer is not going to appreciate a school district shutting a parent out. One of the guiding principles of IDEA is that schools and parents are partners, and that partnership is what serves children best. And so when one of those two partners is not working together, that's going to be viewed as a problem, and it is a problem, and that shouldn't happen.
Now, I know that we talked about this and I didn't have time to kind of include it in the story. Just want you to tell me about how frustrating it is for you as an education expert when you hear from all of these families, when they are reaching out to you constantly for resources, and when you, not frustrating of them doing that, but frustrating for the situation that these families are in that you try to help on a daily basis.
I feel for them. I truly feel for them. It's not supposed to be this way. Having a child with a disability in and of itself creates a lot of stressors and challenges for families. And in a perfect world, schools would always be the a great resource for families. And I will say, we often hear the stories of people who are upset with the system and people who are really happy. They're not logging on at 7:30 at night to express their concerns because everything's working well. And so there's a lot of tremendous inclusive Texas public schools, great teachers, great principals, great superintendents that are really doing an amazing job. But when it doesn't go well, it's truly sad. And honestly, I was a school administrator. I oversaw special education, and one of the reasons why I wanted to be a professor was I wanted to speak out about some of the issues that I was seeing in the school district I was working in, where the school district was falling short of serving students with disabilities well. And there were larger structural problems that weren't just a part of that district. But as an administrator, I couldn't speak to those things, and so I feel really blessed and really grateful to be a professor and be able to do research and be able to talk in these sorts of venues and meet with parents and help explain their rights and also try to advocate. We really need to see principals, superintendents, teachers, their unions, also expressing greater frustration with the state around the way that they fund and oversee and monitor special education, because that's where a lot of the challenges, I think, really lie in kind of the state's role.
Well, we thank you for, sharing your insight with us and being an expert and joining us to, answer our viewers' questions, answer parents' questions. I know we are the education station, so we want everyone who's tuned in to know we are here for you. We're answering your questions. Ask away. Mr. DeMatthews has taken some time from his evening just to do this, and we are so appreciative of it. We've got another question that came in. This parent's child is in 9th grade with an IEP, and they want to know, how will his accommodations be a negative with him if he gets a sports scholarships? This parent says that some teachers say to get him away from special education before he graduates, that he won't get looked at by any schools to provide these things. Any advice on that? I know sometimes you've told me sometimes kids get moved out of special education, but what's your advice to this parent? I mean, they seem pretty concerned. This is a big deal when you're thinking about college.
Yeah. So again, a guiding piece of advice that parents need to know is that there's not one size fits all. So if a teacher tells you this is going to be a problem, down the road, and you shouldn't do this or you should do that, there's not a blanket statement you can make. Hopefully your child is in special education and actually needs those accommodations to be successful at this present moment. Now, it's important, especially for a 9th grader, to have a transition plan, which is required by laws as being part of the IEP when the child's in 9th grade at that age, or approaching age 16, depending on where your district kind of starts this process. But the child should be involved in this conversation, the parent, in IEP meetings, discussing what's going to happen when the child finishes high school, what skills, what supports are they going to need. But I don't believe that just the simple fact that a child has an IEP or has some accommodations in their IEP, that's going to stop them from playing college sports or receiving a scholarship to play college sports. I actually played college basketball. I know that some of my peers, teammates, had been in special education. And so I don't see that in particular as a barrier. But they do parents, you want to be intentional about planning to make sure your child's ready for college, because at the university level, there is not the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and universities are not responsible for providing some of the same services that public schools are. So a lot of what happens in the public schools, IEPs, assessments, evaluations, team meetings, they don't happen in college.
So good information for parents to know. Is there anything that you have noticed when parents come to you that a lot of them are unaware of that they should be? Especially, we're still waiting on some more questions. So is there something that comes to mind?
Sure. I think one of the most important things is parents knowing the procedural safeguards, knowing the full scope of their rights. And so at every single IEP meeting, the parent should receive the procedural safeguards. I shared that in one of the links that I sent over. That document, it's a little lengthy, but it's translated by TEA in virtually every language. And so parents should familiarize themselves with that. That is an important step. And I would also say that trying to build relationships, positive, trusting relationships with teachers and with the principal is also a piece of advice that I always give. The principal's job, teachers' jobs are really hard. They're really stressful. They're working with a lot of students, and it's an intensive job. And having parents kind of at your throat or doubting you or questioning you or just that can be really hard, especially day in and day out. When you're not treated well, you're not paid well. And so building those relationships with school, with educators and administrators, I think is also really important. And then though, when something's not going well, not being proactive about it. So observing your child in class. So if you can get away from work, get in that classroom, see how they're doing, ask questions, check those progress reports. Be as proactive as possible. I think that's really important as well. And then I would also just say, pay attention to this as a policy issue and vote accordingly. There's only so much a lot of schools and school districts can do under these current conditions. And so I would encourage folks to follow those issues. And education is one of the most important issues in our state.
Thank you so much. And a same question from that same parent. And again, just want to reiterate, know your rights, get involved with the school district, find other parents. And again, khou.com, we've got a link of resources, like he mentioned, in different languages when you click on those links. So this question from that parent, how does the parent support their 9th grade student at his upcoming ARD? He hasn't passed any state tests since 3rd grade, but his classwork is passing. They just want to make sure the school is not just passing him along when he makes grades lower than a 70% on assignments. Will this in any way affect his going to a college or university?
So the most important thing for going to a college or a university is graduating with a regular high school diploma. And so hopefully they've already been having discussions in middle school, but in 9th grade, the IEP team should be doing a transition plan, like I noted previously. So the parents, the child, and the rest of the IEP team at the school, they should be discussing what that child's post-secondary goals are, and the IEPs should reflect helping that child be prepared for that next step. And so if the child wants to go to university, then that IEP should have goals that allow that child to work towards that, being successful in that regard. If they want to go to the military, if they want to go to trade school, whatever it is, they want to go into a career, that transition planning component of the IEP is really important. It's often one that's very much overlooked. It's an area where a lot of school districts and a lot of states are often out of compliance. And so I would encourage the parent to start there. And also, if they're concerned about their child failing the STAR and maybe getting passed along, look at the IEP. What are the annual goals in that IEP? What are the progress monitoring tools to see that your child is meeting those annual goals, and look at the data that is supposed to be tracked and monitored to meet that goal. And so it's not just about STAR. STAR is one measure. It's a flawed measure in many ways. We want to have data to have a sense of what's happening in schools. It's not the best measurement tool for one individual student who sits down on one given day and takes that one specific test. That's not a great predictor of what that student actually knows. So it's really understanding what's in that IEP and then trying to verify with data, with classroom data from the teacher, if the child is making progress.
So again, really looking at that IEP, talking to teachers, knowing your rights. It kind of, it boils down to those top three things, which are so important for us to reiterate. Now, we've got another question. Why aren't accommodation logs required to show proof that services are being provided?
Can you say that one more time?
Why aren't accommodation logs required to show proof of the services being provided?
Well, the school district needs to document that services are being provided. So related service providers, so say your child is receiving speech or counseling or occupational therapy, those should be those services do need to be logged, because if there are missed services, the school district, in most cases, is going to be responsible for making up those services. Those would be compensatory services. So there should be, if there's an issue with the school district not wanting to share whether the child is receiving those services, that's a different question, and parents have a right to request that information. And again, with all these things, kind of going back to knowing your rights, in the procedural safeguards, it's very clear that parents have rights to request records and see what's being done. And so go to those procedural safeguards, reference that, and I would encourage people, put it in writing, email, so that you can have a record that you were requesting information, and you'll see the response back from them, or lack thereof.
And so a reminder, if you're a parent and you want that information, you want to request things from the school district, you have that right to do it. They can't deny you or anything like that. So a reminder for parents, they can email. Who should they email directly for that data, for that information?
If again, you want to have open lines of the teacher is the most important person in your child's life. They see them the most, they have the most interaction with them. So the teachers that serve your children, that's the first place you want to ask for information from. And then beyond that, if you're not getting the information, you want to move up the chain of command, and you want to talk to the assistant principal or principal. If that's not working, you want to talk to the school district special education director or the superintendent.
Well, thank you so much. That was our last question of the evening, but want to remind viewers that we are your education station. You can find our story from the 6 o'clock this evening at khou.com, and in that story you will find links provided by Mr. DeMatthews for parents who need help. And I know you, of course, always take questions from parents outside of doing these interviews and things like that. So we thank you so much for that. And also, this is going to be on KHOU Plus, so you can go back and rewatch it if there was something you may have missed, wanted to hear again, as well on our YouTube page. And one thing we want to go ahead and tell you, Mr. DeMatthews, someone said that the information is so helpful, and to thank you and us for just providing this information and time. So again, thank you for helping us put that story together, and thank you for helping us help our viewers, our parents who have questions.
It's my pleasure. And just know your rights. Try as best as you can to partner with your school district. Be proactive, and also appreciate the people that work in public schools for the work that they're doing. They've not been well respected, and I would say pay attention to what the legislature does or doesn't do, because it is having an effect on your school, and it's having an effect on your child. And the students who have the most needs are the ones that are going to be disproportionately impacted. So I just wanted to share that, and I hope everybody has a great rest of the school year, and thanks for the opportunity to talk, and you can feel free to reach out to me if you need anything.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to our viewers for tuning in. You can join back tonight at 10 o'clock for KHOU News at 10.